afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Gillis, and I serve as a program officer for campus advancement here at Young America's Foundation. And it is my pleasure to welcome back to the stage Governor Scott Walker and to introduce Secretary Linda McMahon. Appointed by President Trump, Secretary McMahon was sworn in as the 13th United States Secretary of Education. Secretary McMahon graduated from East Carolina University, and her college aspirations to become a school teacher reflect her lifelong interest in education. She served on the Connecticut State Board of Education and on the Board of Trustees at Sacred Heart University. Secretary McMahon sought to bring her focus on education and economic opportunity to the national stage through 2 runs for the United States Senate in Connecticut. She also gained experience in business as the CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment. Thanks to her leadership, the company created thousands of American jobs and sparked the Secretary's passion for career and technical education. Secretary McMahon served as administrator of the United States Small Business Administration during President Trump's first term. She then went on to chair at the America First Policy Institute and served as the co-chair of President Trump's 2024 transition team. With all of that, please join me in welcoming Governor Walker and Secretary McMahon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me try that again. You just had lunch, so good afternoon. Yeah, see, now
all
they're
right, now we're good.
I just told the secretary that this is the largest crowd that we've ever had at the National Conservative Student Conference. I don't know how we'd cram any more people in here, but let's give, again, you heard Nicole's introduction, but let's give another round of applause for the 13th Secretary of Education to be here with us.
Thank you.
We're so glad to have you here. I thought maybe right off the bat, as I mentioned, it's the 13th Secretary of Education. The first administration was the head of the Small Business Administration. But before that, you had a pretty illustrious career in the private sector and business. Would you share a little bit with the students about not only what that was, but maybe a little bit about how that prepared you not only for this job, but even the job you had in the first term? Because you really were pretty well prepared for the kind of attention you get now.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's good to see you again. I just have one question. We have a runway here?
Yeah.
What was happening on the runway?
Well, we had, for example, last night, Ben Carson was here. We put him right at the end, but we thought with 2 chairs to give a little more space so you could see all the way around.
Okay.
No fashion show or anything like that.
I didn't know if I had to walk the runway or anything like that. But, you know, it was my prior business was really, really a fun job. It was World Wrestling Entertainment. How many of you know? And it was a wonderful business to build from the ground up. Vince McMahon and I took it from a small regional kind of wrestling in high schools and that sort of thing to really taking it to being a national, then an international company. And taking it public on the New York Stock Exchange. It is now considered one of the greatest cultural and entertainment exports in the world. So it's really fun to have done that. But let me just give you a little bit of caution. During the process of building a company like that, we also went bankrupt one time and lost everything and had to rebuild. So I just give you some caution that... And I think my best bit of advice is to say, don't be afraid to take risks. Because if you never fail at anything, you're never really going to grow. And it's really not how you fall, it's how you get back up. So it was really, really a lot of fun. And I ran for the Senate in Connecticut. I ran for the U.S. Senate in Connecticut twice, and I didn't win. Which I think was really a good thing, because then I went on to serve twice in the administration with President Trump. But I was asked once, well, what are you going to do if you're in the well of the Senate and you cannot get any of these senators to just come on board with you? And I said, I'm going to have a ring set up. I'm going to lay the smackdown on the one that didn't do it.
I think there are times when many of us as taxpayers wish, whether you're in the Senate or not, you'd be able to do that, because there's a few senators that either could do that or maybe have some term limits so that they'd be bringing some new senators to get the job done. So tell me a little bit about, actually, just as an aside, you mentioned me you were at Hulk Hogan's memorial services yesterday.
It was.
Really pretty special to have been the leader, to grow that organization. As kids, I talked to you about yesterday about a long time ago when I was a kid. You mentioned it being regional. It really was regional. I can still remember on local TV, wrestling was like on a small rink with a couple people on the side. But you took superstars like Hulk Hogan and really made him into a worldwide phenomena. It must have been pretty special to be there and pay your respects.
Truly was, and we were there with his family, and gosh, I think there were must have been about 1,200 people there yesterday for the funeral services, and it was just very special because WWE had put together a sort of a great montage of the history of Hulk Hogan, and so it was a big walk down memory lane, a lot of nostalgia because that goes all the way back to the early 1980s. So it was really fun, really fun. Well, it was fun to see. It was certainly sad to be there for his funeral services.
Bittersweet, right?
Bittersweet.
Fun to see the memories, and we saw him last actually in Milwaukee, just down the road from my home, when he was in for the national convention last year.
Right, that's right.
So, on a larger issue, I'd love to talk, and I think these students, folks in college, some of them have been through our high school program before, really interested both not only in your position, but as it ties into President Trump's overall agenda. Where do you see education going when we think about kindergarten through 12th grade, and again, with all these students here in colleges and universities across the country, where do you see the policies of this administration going forward when it comes to tackling the big challenges we have both in K through 12 and higher education?
Well, first of all, you probably have heard the president certainly, when he asked me to take on this job, he said, I have a very different kind of assignment for you. He said, I really want you to shut down the Department of Education. I want you to be the last Secretary of Education. And his reason behind that is he believes, as do I, that the best education is that's closest to the student, to the child. He believes that parents should be number one in deciding where their children go to school. They should have input into the curriculum. They are the first and last voice of what takes place with their children. He certainly believes that states and governors and local superintendents of education have a better idea of what their students need. And, education is not one size fits all. Certainly the kind of education you might get in a rural state is very different from maybe that you would get in New York City or in Dallas, Texas, or in Los Angeles, California. So I think, and what you're preparing students for, because your real goal is to make sure as those students start in kindergarten, as they're moving through the progression of school, that at the end of their education, they are well prepared in life to have a good job, to be able to support their family, and to be independent. So what is it going to take in that community, where they live or where they hope to live? And I think communities should work with schools, K through 12. And now we're seeing, and I'll jump around a little bit, but in high school, starting a little bit in middle school, but mostly in high school, like junior and senior year of high school, and I'm certainly a strong proponent of this, and that is dual credits. That those students are working with maybe community colleges or colleges in their area for credits that the student is taking while in high school that will give them entree into the college program. They will count already. And the good news is you're in a public school, so those credits are getting paid for by the education dollars, that are in that school system. So it's cheaper to be able to do it that way. You have a leg up.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And you have a bit of a leg up going into college because you've already accumulated some credits, so you don't have to be in college as long, and that's also cheaper. But also, going full circle, I certainly believe that not every student has to go to a four-year college in order to be successful. And so I think we ought to be looking at what the curriculum is. How do we prepare these students? You know, there are so many different professions today that students can go to that don't require that they have 4 years in college. And I'm such a proponent of let's look at where is that return on investment. I'm sorry, I have had allergies forever, and going from one part of the country to the other, and I came from Florida this morning, so forgive me a little bit.
Well, if nothing else, we can blame it on the smoke from Canada.
So I think we really have to look at our paradigm of education and how we want to see that change. And I want to help to be one of those agents of change, and I think I would like, and President Trump does not call himself this, but I would certainly like for him to be able to have one of his legacies to be the education president, because in returning education to the states where I think it's best served.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting, particularly when you talked about dual enrollment a moment ago. I remember during the president's first term, I was governor of Wisconsin at the time, and we had an event at the Waukesha Technical College, not too far from my home in the state of Wisconsin. And we had a great example. A student that was with us, she had taken dual enrollment in high school. She was part of a welding program, dual enrollment with the local technical college. And a week after she graduated from high school, she actually had her degree, her certification in welding, and was being hired the week after the president was in town. And so she got to meet the president, and that was the story we told. But it was a great example. She was ready right to go into the workforce. She was going to make a job at $90,000 a year. She had done both together by doing exactly what you're talking about. But that's a great example. The larger point, which was that was something that worked at that local level. That school district and that technical college district worked together to make it happen. It wasn't a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington that told them to do that. That was something that was done at the local level. So maybe to take a step and expound on this, I mentioned you're the 13th Secretary of Education. Tomorrow night we're going to hear from the 79th Secretary of the Treasury. His original predecessor was Alexander Hamilton. We were laughing before. I don't think anybody's heard of the original Secretary of Education, but that goes all the way back to Jimmy Carter's administration. And even in the next term, just a few years later, President Ronald Reagan was already trying to dissolve the Department of Education, which is exactly what this president's trying to do, and hopefully with the help of Congress will do on a permanent basis. But what are the next steps? Because when I was a governor, we totally agree with that. Send the power, the resources and the responsibilities back to the states, but more importantly to the schools and to the parents and families to make a difference. The president's been out front giving you that charge going forward, taking a series of actions, but long term to make that permanent, we need the help of the Congress. So what are the next steps to make that happen?
Well, we do have to have the vote of Congress to close down the Department of Education. It was established by Congress, and we do have to have the votes to shut down the Department of Education. So what I've explained, and I try to meet with some of the senators and the congressmen and men and women often to explain, let me show you how this can work. Let me work with different departments and agencies. For instance, we have signed, which I have the authority to do, I've signed what's called a Memo of Understanding with the Department of Labor, because there are programs that are in education that are partially handled by labor, partially handled by education, workforce development, the management of Pell Grants and WIOA, I think it's pronounced. And so why should that be happening? So I want to transfer the part that education is doing to the Labor Department, which is workforce development, which makes sense to me is where it belongs. So as I have spoken to some of the senators about this, I said, we're going to take this. The funding will come from the Department of Education.
So let's talk free speech. Linda McMahon is a corrupt billionaire donor who knows nothing.
Apparently, it's the CCP didn't like that. They're cutting into our technology.
We're getting a little feedback in here.
I think it was a few of the liberal senators in connection with the CCP thought they'd try and cut into that.
So, you know, what's interesting is that when I talked to the centers and I said, let me show you how this will work. We'll take this program out of the Department of Labor, out of education, we'll put it into the Department of Labor. We'll make sure that you understand what we're going to be able to accomplish by that. And the Senate then actually has to vote on moving that one program from Department of Education permanently into the Department of Labor. So I said, we'll do it some pieces at the time, big pieces. And they, you know what, I've gotten some buy-in to that.
Nice.
And I hope, I said, let's just look at how it can be effective. And so I've had a couple of senators who've said, well, that just makes sense to me. Yeah. Seems to be common sense. I'm going, yeah, right, just common sense. So that's really what we're trying to do. And we're trying to streamline it, trying to take away a lot of the regulatory environment. I mean, you know from being a governor how much red tape goes along with the funding that comes back to the states. And probably most of you in here know that 90% of the cost of education in states is borne by the states, most of the time through property taxes or other kinds of taxes. So the federal government provides, some cases, 8%, 10%, sometimes as high as 12%. But if you think about it in totality, that's really a very small part. But all of the regulations almost attached to that money come from the federal government. To the extent that I heard that I was given a statistic the other day, out of every dollar that comes into the classroom, about 47 cents is spent on regulatory compliance. Well, let's let that money go to the students and go to the states and higher teacher salaries and those things that can make a difference in those states. And so that's what we're going to be trying to do.
Well, and it's really, yes. I just remind everybody, because as you talk about this point, if this debate comes up on your campus or in your communities, just to echo what the Secretary said, it's about 90% is not coming from the federal government. So that means it's from the state government or the local property taxpayer or some other set of revenues. It's not from the federal government. Yet there's all these regulations that are handed down from Washington back not only to the states, but to the local governments. I did have to chuckle when that interference came in. Knowing a thing or two about taking on big government special interests like you're going to have to do with this. We had about 100,000 protesters in our capital for about a month, and there were a lot of interchanges like that as well, because same people. The people who were defenders of the status quo didn't want us to go ahead with common sense, and the good news is many years later, there's been survey after report after report that showed that educational attainment actually went up after the reforms that we did in Wisconsin, and presumably I think the same thing would be true the more we sent those responsibilities back to the states, the schools, and the parents.
Well, and I bet you would attest to this, that governors are competitive.
Yes.
They want their state to do well. So if another state is outperforming what you're doing in your state, you take a look at what they're doing. How does that work? The state of Mississippi, just a few years ago, implemented what was called the science of reading. Yeah. They went back to teaching phonetics and looking at outcomes. And they had what was called the Mississippi Miracle. They went from number 50, in education literacy development up to about number 30-something to start with. And then they're making progress, all along. Louisiana has adopted it. Florida has adopted the science of reading. Iowa now. Many other states have as well. And they are seeing their national report card called the NAEP scores go up. Now, I bet you might have heard this statistic, but it's incredible to me that currently in our country, that eighth graders, only 30% of eighth graders are reading proficiently. Yeah. 30%. That means 70% are not. And a little bit less than that are math proficient. Mm-hmm. So we have to get these scores up. We are way, way down the list internationally as well. And when President Trump came in and saw those scores, that came out shortly after he won the election, he said, this has to change. This is embarrassing. And he was angry about it. So not only did he charge me that we have to close down the Department of Education, and I'll just take a little side note, when I was being Senate confirmed for the position, I was really attacked a little bit by some of the senators who were saying, so what are you actually going to be doing? Why would you close down the Department of Education? And I said, Senator, clearly something that we're doing is not working. We've spent $3 trillion since the Department of Education was established, and we've seen our performance scores occasionally tick up a little, but by and large there, the graph has gone like this. We're not doing something right. Let's make sure that we are changing what we're doing. I'm so happy we're getting to share this feed.
Yeah, I said it's the wonders of hacking, apparently, in the world of free speech. These folks on campus have dealt with this before. If liberals don't like your ideas, they try and shut you down. But these students know if you're under attack, YAF's got your back. And even here on this stage, we're not going to back down from the truth. That's what folks do when they have poor ideas. They just try to power over everybody else. And even when it comes to hacking into a system, we're not going to let that happen. But
it goes a little bit along with this, not quite the same thing, but I remember my mother telling me one time when I wasn't being very articulate and I was swearing. And now and then, but my mother told me, she said, using swearing instead of really good words is the mark of a vocabulary cripple. So I thought, okay, well.
We know here that, again, this is the sort of thing we've dealt with time and time again, but I'm curious, we talk about, you just talked about reading scores, and one of the things I saw as a governor was if you go from learning to read from about 6 months on until about 3rd or 4th grade, and then from that point, the rest of your time in school, you use reading to learn. And students, sadly, if they're behind on those scores, end up dropping out and all sorts of challenges there. So what sorts of things we do? One of the things we talked about backstage that you and I have talked about before is education freedom. That not only improving our traditional government-run schools, but giving families and particularly students choices, giving them options in education. What more can we do to promote really the idea that the funding should follow the student and not the system?
Right. Well, absolutely, and President Trump is just absolutely committed to school choice. He doesn't believe that any child should be trapped in a failing school. And in the big beautiful bill, there was about $60 million put in, first of all, for the remainder of the spending of this school year, and then ongoing, increasing the budget for school choice up to now about $500 million. That's a significant amount of money to give students choice. And as you and I discussed, it was the silver lining of COVID that parents, for the first time, were able to see the kinds of curriculum that students had in their school. There was a lot of, there was a lot of DEI, there was a lot of wokeness in the curriculum. And so it was incredibly eye-opening, to parents who saw that. And so they wanted to make sure that they had more control over the curriculum in their schools. And so for the first time, they were attending board meetings. They were doing a lot of the things that made them involved in what their children's education was. And so that was incredibly important. And I urge parents, go to school board meetings, run for the school board so that you can have impact in what your children are doing, because that is incredibly important.
So I'm curious, you served as the head of the Small Business Administration in the first term, and now you're in a second term in an incredibly important position, but not just in the change of your position. What are things like that are different in the second term?
Well, it's really interesting because when President Trump came into the first term, even though he had run a gigantic business worldwide, it was really a family business. And so it was very interesting, much like I had run a family business that then became a public company. So it had very different, requirements running a public company. And so it took him a while to get, I think, the White House organized, to understand how that worked. He had his family in the White House. I know that Jared and Ivanka were incredibly helpful to him. But he had, some staff changes pretty quickly as people understood what his working style was, and he understood, them. So, but this time, he knew the story. He knew how to, how to make things work, how to make things run. He had the people coming in that he really wanted to work with him, and then he'd have this little gap. Sometimes kids in college take a gap year. Well, he didn't voluntarily take a gap term, but I think it turned out to be an incredible thing for him to have the time to reflect and to see what the other administration had done, where he thought the weaknesses were. And then the organization that I chaired during that time frame called the America First Policy Institute, which was actually the brainchild of Brooke Rollins, who was the head of the president's Deputy Policy Council in the White House. And she had set up the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So she knew exactly how a think tank worked. She knew what was responsible. And they had, in preparation for a second term, Brooke and Larry Kudlow and Robert O'Brien had all worked on this great continuation of the great policy that the president had in place, which involved education, international politics, all of that. And he was just ready to go. So when the election didn't go the way we had hoped that it would go, Brooke and Larry and Robert said, we can't just let all this policy just die. So the America First Policy Institute was begun. Brooke invited me to come in. I chaired it. So we kept working on policy. We kept working on developing the people who could go into the White House to be helpful. And when the president was elected this time, 7 executives out of AFPI went in as cabinet members. I was very pleased to be one of those. And then about 78 of the staffers are now in the administration. So the president was able to have this very smooth transition with people who knew his policy and to make it work. And so I think that's really been one of the critical differences. His experience level, having the policy that was continuation of policy that he wanted. He tweaked it, he made it different, he changed, he brought in more, but he kind of had a foundation, which I think was very helpful.
It's been remarkable. We've talked about this, a number of speakers have the last couple of days, to see how aggressively this administration has worked really in the first 6 months of this year. I think it's been more successful than any administration, certainly in my lifetime, and maybe even arguably in the history of the country. It's really been remarkable, and it's a testament, obviously, a bit of maybe divine providence, that gap of those 4 years for the president and the team. You mentioned the America First Institute. I'm proud as a former governor still be a part of the Governor's Council, and I know with Brooke, who now is the Secretary of Agriculture, a good example is governors were ready to jump on a partnership with her and with the states and Secretary Kennedy on pushing back on food stamps. For example, the idea that a number of states are now getting waivers so that they don't have to provide junk food as part of food stamps out there, as part of what's technically called the TANF program. So it has been remarkable to see that kind of change. We certainly see it from afar, but it's good to see it there. Sergio Gore, who's an alumni of this organization as well, was here yesterday. He handles White House personnel. He said they filled with something like 90% of the at-will positions, which is a stark contrast to the beginning of the last term. So that's really, really important because personnel is policy. If you have the right people in place, they can help you get things done. In the first term, we saw, at least early on, some of the people that lingered from the Obama administration were people who undermined some of the work out there. I mentioned before, these are students in universities and colleges all across the country. Many of them deal with some of the shenanigans that apparently some others were involved with earlier, trying to take us off track here. But I think they would love to hear your thoughts when we think about higher education. One of the big challenges I hear from students here and as we travel the country is free speech. A lot of people profess, they love to say they're all for free speech, but when it comes to conservative organizations and conservative voices, there's outright bans on the ability to speak out or undue restrictions, unrealistic barriers that don't apply to any other liberal groups. Thoughts on that and what more of these students and even your team at the Department of Education can do to help level the playing field? Well,
thank you very much for that question, because you might have been following. It's not quite free speech, but I think it gets to free speech. You might be following some of the actions that the Department of Education has taken against some of the universities for their lack of protecting students on campus, primarily the anti-Semitism that we've seen across campuses, where where there were protests that were being held that prevented students going to class, where there were actually students at Columbia that were imprisoned in the library, and students on the outside banging on the windows of that library, yelling, "Death to Jews, death to Israel," sometimes death to the United States. So the president campaigned on the fact that he was not going to allow not only anti-Semitism on campus, but any sort of that kind of prejudicial treatment of students of any belief. And so as we really crack down on that, we now have, I think, a very solid deal with Columbia. That one's signed. We've done one with Brown. There are other universities that we're looking at. But I was asked and actually was accused of perhaps shutting down free speech. I said, absolutely not. That is not what this is about. I said, students on the Columbia campus, because specifically I was asked, shouldn't Palestinians be able to protest on campus? I said, absolutely. But it has to be peaceful protest. And in the agreement with Columbia, it gives everyone the right to protest. But at particular times, at particular places, you can't protest in the halls of some of the academic buildings to prevent other students from getting in there to study, or in the library. So particular places on campus, particular times, you can't do it at 2 a.m. in the morning. You need to get, permission to have a protest at times that are appropriate, on campuses. And you cannot wear masks unless it is for a religious purpose or a health reason. But if you're wearing a mask, then you have to have your student ID. And if asked by a policeman or a patrol on campus, you have to temporarily take off that mask to show that you are who you say you are, because we had so many outsiders coming in for these protests. We had students who were hurt on campuses, faculty that were attacked on campuses. That's not part of freedom of speech. That is violence, and we will actually, investigate you for civil rights violations, which are Title VI, and that's what we've done. And so the penalties that have been put on those universities were for not protecting students' rights and having students feel safe on campus. So there's a very big difference between the First Amendment and freedom of speech and the right to protest, and we've encouraged all of these universities, look, you should be offering all of those, but you need to have equal viewpoints on campuses, and one can't be shut out at the expense of the other. And if I may, what we're really trying to get universities to get back to, colleges and universities, is being those places where you do have discussions and different opinions and debates, and really that broadening of your thinking and understanding of things. That is the place to do it. That freedom of speech, that understanding, and actually places of learning, and it's just, we devolve from that. And students have to feel safe walking across campus. I just wanted to add that too.
Absolutely. That's so important, and it fits in so well to what we've been saying the last couple of days. A number of us talked about not only the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution. And it's interesting. Free speech, obviously, freedom of assembly guaranteed in the Constitution, but it should be revered on our college campuses.
Absolutely.
And yet that's where it's most at risk. I know a number of the students here, I've talked to many of you in the past, were particularly the last couple of years, were on campus when these encampments happen. Many, in my case in Wisconsin, actually in outright violation of state law when it comes to putting tents up overnight, which, by the way, all of you in college can appreciate this. It wasn't that many years ago I was there. I couldn't afford identical brand new Coleman tents when I was in college. So I don't know if it's George Soros or who, but all those tents going up were not college students paying for them. They were an organized outside effort. But I thought, you mentioned being in Florida the other day, Governor DeSantis and particularly Ben Sasse, who at the time, originally when the encampments were going on, I thought handled it beautifully, exactly what you're talking about, where he put out a notice to all the students at the University of Florida, said, you have a right to speak out, but here's the guidelines. You can't have signs over the side. You can't block someone from going across campus. You can't camp overnight. You can't threaten someone physically. You can't issue these things, but you can protest with these forms. But if you violate these terms, you're going to be expelled. Clear consequences. Because sadly, I remember one of our campuses, particularly UCLA, Matt Weinberg, the chair at the time at that campus, a Jewish student, was prohibited by protesters from going across the campus to get to his classes. And that, in this country, in this time, should be completely unacceptable, whether you're Jewish, Christian, any other faith. Your religious beliefs should never stop you. So we're thankful to have a president and a secretary of education who understand that and want to defend the rights of our students, no matter where they might be across this country. One more interesting thing in that regard, kind of in that same vein. So a year ago, Young America's Foundation got involved with a lawsuit that we no longer have, so we're not in conflict, but against the U.S. Department of Education because of a policy your predecessor and the previous president were involved in, which changed Title IX. Now, a lot of times people are Title IX. Title IX is not just about women's sports. It's about women and higher education in general. It was done to kind of level the playing field to make sure that young women, about half of all the crowd here today are young college women. But about a year or so ago, the Biden administration took it upon themselves to change the definition of Title IX from sex to gender. And that wasn't just bad enough. They took it so far as to increase the penalties. So even as we talked about last night, even a female swimmer or members of a female swim team who objected to someone being placed on their team who had previously swam on the men's team, those women could be in violation of Title IX with that change in the definition. We went to court. We did a suit jointly with Moms for Liberty. We got an injunction, and any campus in America where someone was a part of YAF or where students had parents who were part of Moms for Liberty got relief from that injunction. Now, that has gone away. That is no longer the case. You have a president and a secretary and administration who actually believe in defending women in women's sports. My question is, not only thanking you for that, but how do we make that permanent so that someday, God forbid, there isn't some future president, future administration who tries to revert back to what we saw just a year and a half ago?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I think ultimately the Supreme Court is going to make that decision. The definition of men and women, I think the Supreme Court is finally going to have to rule on that because, in the courts that was reversed, from the Biden administration. And so we are back to men and women being boys and girls as to how you're born. And it is not determined by gender under Title IX. And so that is the law right now. That is what we are observing and enforcing. But you're right. Another president could come in, another administration. So I do believe that, and I believe that is now pending before the Supreme Court. I don't know that it'll be decided before, they come back in full session, but I think that's going to have to be a declaration by the Supreme Court. And once they decide, then that's how it will be. And I think that will be a good thing so that it won't be confusing any longer, and everyone will know what the law of the land will be. But clearly the president's executive order is very clear that men are men and women are women, and men cannot compete in women's sports because it's just incredibly unfair. As a matter of fact, we've just finalized a settlement with the University of Pennsylvania, in which probably many of you in here know the case of Riley Gaines, who lost to Leah Thomas, who was a transgender swimmer. And in the settlement with the University of Pennsylvania, that title then was taken away from Leah Thomas, properly awarded to the women who would have won there, an apology sent out to the women swimmers, and all of the titles that then were won by any transgender participant were awarded to the women who would have won those had there not been. And when you understand the full impact of that, it's not just that moment of losing, which is devastating, to women who have really trained so hard. And but for the fact that there was a transgender competitor would have won handily. Yeah. But the other thing is it impacts scholarship opportunities for women. It undermines now NIL opportunities for women and for sponsorship opportunities. And so it's just simply not fair. Absolutely. So we've really tried to level the playing field for the common sense approach that women should compete against women and men should compete against men. But I want to take that a little bit further too, because some of the young women that have been on panels with me or have come to see me have said not only is it the competition factor, but when you have men in women's dressing rooms. Yep. And I had 2 young women who said they were so uncomfortable, they were on the track team, that the boy, the male who was in the locker room, was already dressed and ready to go and just sat and watched the women undress and redress. And they just were so uncomfortable with that. And it's just not right. Just not right.
You're exactly right. Well, and it's a prime example where conservatives are actually standing up for women, not just in women's sports, but women overall. Makes a huge difference. We've had actually at this conference on the stage, Riley Gaines talked exactly about what you're talking about. Oh, okay, so you had
Riley. That's great.
And she's talked about the competition side of it. But Paula Scanlon, who many of you have had on campus as well, another one of our speakers, Paula was a teammate on Penn, and she talked about exactly what you just said about how the rest of the women's swim team just kind of were over on the side and just really felt very threatened by the whole situation of having to share that locker room. And it's just not fair. That's one of the key arguments we make on the campus. It's about fairness. We wouldn't let a 19-year-old woman swim against a group of 9-year-olds because their bodies wouldn't be the same any more than we should let someone who's born a man compete against a woman. Yep. Exactly right. One more quick question, and in a moment I'm going to wrap it up. But I'm curious. I know the Department of Education doesn't have direct control over this. You don't regulate it. There's no legal requirement over it. But I do know one of the challenges, not only in higher education, but I still remember one of my sons, Matthew, years ago was in an AP class in high school, and the teacher was actually really great. She tried to be even, Steven, kind of level the playing field. But he came home one day when I was governor early on, and he had an assignment from the textbook that was on a chapter that claimed that Ronald Reagan's tax cuts brought about the deficits of the 80s. And I'm looking, earlier we heard from Dr. Art Laffer. I see a bunch of you have his book there. The book itself spells out that the tax cuts, like they did in many of the states, my own included, when we cut taxes, actually, we had surpluses. Why? Because you give people more money back, they invest it, they do things, it improves the economy. That's exactly what happened with the Reagan tax cuts. It was the Congress that spent more on top of it. It wasn't the tax cuts that brought about the deficits. But I felt bad for Matt and the other students because here they were stuck with a textbook that was factually inaccurate. Yeah. And oftentimes people say, books we get assigned aren't necessarily accurate, particularly textbooks and curriculum. Even though it's not the Department of Education, at least the federal level's responsibility or legal authority, are there things we can be doing to push back and try and at least have an objective curriculum and textbooks out in our schools across the country?
Well, that's where I think parental involvement is so key. If parents can go to their school boards or their local superintendents and get support at the ground level to really point out these things. And that's what happened after COVID.
Yes.
That parents really did become so involved in understanding the curriculum that their students were being taught and just demanded. Now, there were a lot of other, they might not have been looking at tax cuts right away. They were looking at what they thought was some sexually explicit material that shouldn't have been in the classrooms. And gosh, and even in the state of Virginia, parents who came in and really were very, very vocal, and those became heated, heated meetings. In fact, the parents were actually at one point designated as domestic terrorists.
Right.
Can you imagine? Because they were standing up for their children. But I think that parental involvement, understanding, what is in the curriculum, and just fighting for what you know to be right, and involvement with. There are some wonderful organizations. I mentioned America First Policy Institute. That's one. Moms for Liberty, Moms for America. There are many organizations that have very good platforms to help with that understanding, and I think that's where the local level and push comes in. And that's when electing governors becomes so important, that when electing school boards, state school boards as well as local school boards, it's all so absolutely important for parents to be involved. Because when I talk about parents becoming involved, I mean also there's a responsibility for the parental side. Parents will say, no, give me, I want to have say over what my kids are learning in school. Okay, well then have a say. Take that responsibility. Check and see what they're studying. Take a look at it, because it can be very eye-opening.
Without a doubt, it is, to summarize what you're saying, it's as important to make sure you understand what happens in your house is as important, if not more so, than who's elected in the White House. That's really important, but when it comes to education, not only for yours as students now, but as you think about your own families in the future, what happens in your house is as important, if not more so, than who's in the White House. That's really important, but it all comes back, which is why you want to send more of those responsibilities, not only back to the states and the schools, but ultimately to the parents and the families.
Absolutely. Makes
a huge difference. So I just want to end with this. You said at the onset, you talked a little bit when you talked about your prior experience in the private sector and the great business success that you've had. You gave a bit of advice. I'm curious. I think all these students thinking about, wow, you did this amazing thing when it comes to your business ventures. You've been wildly successful. And the first term as head of the Small Business Administration, you've really taken on a huge challenge. And even here with challenges around you, she is not deterred from anything. She is laser focused. There's no challenge that's too big for her to take on. Really, really impressive. I'm thinking these students here want to know, what other words of advice might you have in parting here today?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. I think what I said before is one thing. Don't be afraid to take risks and make mistakes, because that is one of the first things that I tell young entrepreneurs who are starting a business, that you're going to make mistakes. Not everything you want to do is going to be successful, but don't let that deter you. Just let it be. You chalk that up to lesson learned. Try to protect your downside, but the upside you're going to get to that by taking on some risk, and you learn so much from your mistakes. I always found that I learned more from a failure than I did from a success. So I think that is the best thing I can say to you, whether that's getting a bill passed, whether it's working with a group to try to have a better understanding of a policy situation, whether it's trying to convince those that you're working with or that you're studying with or whatever it is, just stay after it. Make sure you have your facts, do your research, be involved in what you're doing, and just go at it with everything you've got. Because if you don't, you're just not going to make it past a certain point. And I often, I think one of my greatest bits of knowledge from experience is there is no such thing as status quo. You get to a certain level, you're not going to stay there. You're either going to grow or you're going to decline. So if you get to where you think you're at status quo, you better be reaching, you better be going for that next step, because you'll start to decline.
That's brilliant. Well, I want to just say, yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to say publicly to President Donald Trump, thank you for nominating Linda McMahon to be the 13th Secretary of Education. She's a rock star. We're so appreciative for her being here. Thank you so much, Madam Secretary. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. all. Thank you very, very much.